a flight, a seat, a moment of arrogance that unravels everything. Margo Whitmore thought she had power until she used it on the wrong person. She believed she could decide who belonged in first class and who didn't. But Naomi Carter wasn't just any passenger. With one message, she turned a simple act of discrimination into something far bigger than anyone could have predicted. Before this flight lands, careers will crumble, secrets will surface, and the rules of power will be rewritten. Did Margo get what she deserved? Should those who abuse their position face even harsher consequences? Drop a comment below with your thoughts, and let me know where you're watching from. Let's begin. The airport buzzed with its usual orchestra of movement. Wheels rolling against polished tile, clipped conversations over phones, the distant echoes of boarding announcements. But Naomi Carter moved through it all with calm certainty, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She had taken hundreds of flights in her lifetime. The routine was familiar. The small pleasantries, the subtle glances, the way first-class lounges always had that particular scent of leather and expensive coffee. And yet, she knew this moment would be different. She adjusted the silk scarf around her neck, brushing a hand over the soft fabric of her tailored navy blazer. She didn't dress to impress. She dressed because she had earned her place in rooms where others often assumed she did not belong. She approached the first-class boarding lane. The agent at the counter, a young man with professional detachment, scanned her boarding pass with precise efficiency. "Welcome aboard, Miss Carter. Have a great flight." Naomi nodded in return, slipping the ticket into her purse as she strode toward the jet bridge. She barely noticed a pair of sharp eyes following her from a few feet away. Margo Whitmore watched Naomi Carter step onto the plane with a sense of unease. There was something about the way she walked. Too assured, too comfortable. Margo had worked for Falcon Airlines for over 15 years. She knew her passengers. She could tell who belonged in first class the moment they stepped into the cabin. And this woman? She didn't fit. Not because of her clothes, they were immaculate. Not because of her posture, it was poised. But because something in Margo's gut told her she shouldn't be here. Margo had seen it before. People upgrading with miles they hadn't earned. People sneaking into seats meant for someone else. People trying to appear like they belonged when they didn't. It always started the same way. A boarding pass in hand. A confident step toward the wrong seat. And then, an excuse. A mistake. A misunderstanding. Margo never let it slide. So as Naomi Carter passed her by, Margo's lips curled into a slow smirk. She turned, stepping purposefully down the aisle, ready to set things straight. Naomi reached her seat, to a window. She placed her handbag down carefully, adjusting her carry-on beneath the seat in front of her. First-class passengers were already settling in, some adjusting blankets, others ordering drinks from the attendants, moving with rehearsed efficiency. She was about to reach for the in-flight menu when a voice cut through the low hum of conversation. "Excuse me, ma'am." Naomi looked up. Margo Whitmore stood over her, hands clasped, posture stiff with thinly veiled authority. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" A few nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably. Others pretended not to hear. Naomi met her gaze evenly. "Yes, I'm quite sure." Margo's lips tightened. "May I see your boarding pass?" Naomi exhaled slowly. She had played this game before. Without a word, she reached into her purse, retrieving the neatly folded ticket stub. Margo took it, holding it longer than necessary, her eyes flicking over the details. The seat number was correct. The name matched her ID. Everything was in order. But still, Margo handed it back, forcing a tight smile. "Just making sure." Naomi accepted it, folding it back into her purse. But she didn't look away, and neither did Margo. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, as if deciding the conversation was over, Naomi turned her attention back to the menu, her expression calm, unbothered. And Margo? Margo hated that. She turned sharply on her heel, stalking toward the galley. But the unease in her chest didn't fade. Because something about Naomi Carter wasn't just wrong. Something about her was a problem. And Margo Whitmore? She always fixed problems. The last passengers boarded, the flight attendants closing overhead bins with practiced ease. Naomi settled into her seat, preparing for a quiet flight. But something in the air had shifted. She could feel it, the weight of unspoken expectations, the silent judgments hanging over her like turbulence before a storm. She had dealt with this before. She knew how it played out. And yet, as the cabin doors locked and the aircraft prepared for takeoff, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that this time it was going to get worse. Meanwhile, in the galley, Margo leaned toward Jenna Blake, one of the younger flight attendants. "Who's in 2A?" she murmured. Jenna blinked. "Naomi Carter." Margo's fingers drummed against the metal counter. "I think there's been a mistake." Jenna hesitated. "I just checked. Her ticket's valid." Margo's smile was cold. "Not for long." Jenna didn't argue, because when Margo Whitmore decided something, it was already done. She turned away, smoothing her uniform, her mind already working on a solution. Because Naomi Carter might think she belonged here. But before this flight was over, Margo was going to remind her exactly where she stood. Naomi Carter adjusted the strap of her handbag, smoothing out the fabric of her blazer as she settled into seat 2A. The leather was soft beneath her fingertips, the armrest polished to a subtle sheen. Around her, other first-class passengers were already making themselves comfortable, adjusting their reclining seats, ordering pre-flight drinks, or skimming through magazines. But she could feel it, the weight of Margo Whitmore's stare. The flight attendant hadn't moved far. She was a few feet away, near the galley, speaking in hushed tones with one of the younger attendants, Jenna Blake. Though Naomi couldn't hear the exact words, the sharpness in Margo's expression, the slight tilt of her chin, told her enough. She wasn't done. Naomi had dealt with people like Margo before. The ones who didn't need to say certain words aloud to make their meaning clear. The ones who wielded power in small, insidious ways. A subtle delay in service, a passive-aggressive smile, an unnecessary verification of credentials. She had seen it in boardrooms, in hotel lobbies, in exclusive clubs, where people like Margo controlled the invisible lines of who belonged and who didn't. The only difference now was that Naomi wasn't walking away. She picked up the in-flight menu, her fingers steady, pretending not to notice when Margo approached again. "Miss Carter." Margo's voice was smooth but too controlled, like a blade wrapped in silk. Naomi lifted her gaze. "Yes." "It seems there's been a mix-up with your seat assignment," Margo continued, tilting her head with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Naomi set down the menu. "Mix-up?" "Yes," Margo nodded. "Seat 2A was actually reserved for another passenger, Mr. Harrington." She stepped slightly to the side, gesturing down the aisle as a tall, well-dressed young man approached. Connor Harrington, mid-20s, sharp cheekbones, and the kind of effortless arrogance that came with never having to struggle for anything in his life. His navy suit was impeccably tailored, his wristwatch worth more than most people's rent. He barely glanced at Naomi before flashing Margo a practiced, charming grin. "No worries," Connor said, adjusting his cufflinks. "I assume this will be handled?" Margo smiled. "Of course, Mr. Harrington. Just a simple mistake." Naomi slowly exhaled, her patience thinning. She leaned back in her seat, crossing one leg over the other, looking between Margo and Connor as if studying them under a microscope. "That's interesting," she said, voice calm. "Because my ticket says 2A." Jenna, still lingering nearby, tensed slightly. Margo's jaw tightened. "Yes, well," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "Sometimes last-minute changes occur, and we do our best to accommodate our most valued passengers." "And I'm not one of them?" Naomi asked, her tone light but laced with something sharper underneath. Margo hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but Naomi caught it. "It's nothing personal, Miss Carter," Margo continued quickly, "but Mr. Harrington is a priority guest." Naomi arched an eyebrow. "Priority guest?" Connor, clearly growing bored with the conversation, pulled out his phone, scrolling absent-mindedly, as if the outcome was already decided. "You understand," Margo pressed. "If you wouldn't mind relocating, I'd be happy to assist you in finding another seat." Naomi let the words settle. She could feel the eyes on her, passengers pretending not to listen, but waiting to see what she would do. She had choices. She could comply, take whatever second-rate seat Margo tried to shove her into, let the moment pass to avoid further confrontation. Or she could remind them exactly who they were dealing with. Naomi smiled, small, polite, but unyielding. No. Margo blinked. Excuse me. No, Naomi repeated evenly. I will not move. Connor finally looked up from his phone, eyebrows raised in mild surprise. Margo's composure cracked, just slightly. Miss Carter, she tried again, I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly. Naomi cut in, her voice smooth. You assumed I didn't belong in this seat. You assumed I would comply. And now, you're struggling to find a way to make me leave, without saying the quiet part out loud. Jenna sucked in a breath. Connor smirked, amused. Margo's fingers curled into a fist at her side. Miss Carter, she said, the sweetness evaporating from her tone. If you don't move, I will have to take further action. Naomi tilted her head. And what action would that be? Margo hesitated. Naomi held her gaze. Because as far as I'm aware, I have a legally purchased ticket for seat 2A. If you'd like to explain to the captain, or better yet, the airline's legal department, why you're forcibly removing a first-class passenger from her assigned seat, be my guest. Margo's nostrils flared. Connor let out a soft chuckle. Damn, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Jenna took an almost imperceptible step back, as if trying to disappear. For a moment, Margo didn't move. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed toward the front of the cabin, disappearing behind the curtain. Naomi let out a slow breath, picked up the menu again, and resumed reading. Connor gave her an approving glance before taking seat 2C instead, clearly unwilling to push the issue further. The tension in the cabin remained, unspoken but palpable. Naomi knew it wasn't over. Margo wasn't the type to let this go. No, she was just getting started. Margo Whitmore stalked back toward seat 2A, her breath coming fast, her hands curled into tight fists at her sides. Naomi Carter had humiliated her. No one had ever dared to question her authority like that, let alone in front of passengers. The smirk on Connor Harrington's face, the hesitance in Ethan Reed's voice, the way Jenna Blake had nervously looked away, all of it was fuel to the fire burning inside her chest. She had to put Naomi in her place. This was her plane, her first-class cabin. Naomi Carter was just another passenger, and passengers followed orders. She reached the row, standing over Naomi, who hadn't moved an inch. The woman sat there as if she belonged, as if she had every right to be in that seat, as if she hadn't just disrespected the person in charge of the cabin. Naomi didn't even look up immediately. She was too calm, too measured, like she was waiting for Margo to react exactly how she had expected. That made Margo even angrier. Miss Carter, Margo said through gritted teeth, I'm going to give you one last chance to move voluntarily. Naomi finally looked up. Or what? She asked simply. The air around them shifted. The passengers, who had been pretending not to listen, suddenly sat a little straighter. Some had their phones tilted in just the right angle, not outright recording, but ready to. Connor Harrington, who had been watching with amusement before, now seemed genuinely interested in how this was going to play out. Margo felt the weight of every gaze on her, and she knew she had to act fast. She had to show control. This seat is not available for you, Margo said, her voice tight with frustration. Mr. Harrington is a priority passenger, and we have the right to reassign seating as needed. Naomi tilted her head slightly, considering. Then she smiled, just barely, and leaned back in her seat. If that were true, you would have told me that the first time you asked me to move, she said. Instead, you assumed I didn't belong here. And now, you're struggling to come up with a reason that doesn't sound like exactly what it is. Margo's nails dug into her palm. I don't have to explain myself to you. Then stop talking and get security, Naomi said smoothly. A flicker of hesitation crossed Margo's face. Because that was the last thing she wanted to do. If security got involved, it would become an incident. Incidents meant reports. Reports meant attention. She needed Naomi to comply. Now, you're making this harder than it needs to be, Margo warned. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Am I? Or is it you who's making this harder than it needs to be? Something snapped. Before she could think, before she could stop herself, Margo grabbed Naomi's wrist. The contact was brief, barely a second, but it was enough. Enough for every passenger watching to see. Enough for Jenna Blake to gasp softly. Enough for Ethan Reed, standing just a few feet away, to take a cautious step forward. Naomi didn't flinch. She simply turned her head, looking at Margo's grip on her wrist. And then, slowly, deliberately, she pulled her arm away. Margo was breathing too hard. Her heart was pounding too fast. She felt control slipping. And then BP. The sound slammed through the first-class cabin. A sharp gasp rippled through the passengers. A few trays rattled. Someone let out a hushed curse. For a split second, there was only silence. Naomi Carter's head had turned slightly from the impact, but when she looked back at Margo, she wasn't shocked. She wasn't afraid. She was disappointed. Margo's breath hitched. For the first time in her career, she had lost control. Naomi didn't speak. She didn't argue. She didn't make a scene. She simply reached down, picked up her phone, and typed a message. Margo's stomach twisted. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Naomi didn't answer. A few more taps, then send. She placed the phone neatly on the armrest, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. Margo swallowed. "Who did you just message?" she pressed, her voice sharper. Naomi lifted her gaze. "You'll find out soon enough." A cold dread seeped into Margo's spine. The shift in the air was almost tangible now. The power dynamic that she had been fighting to control had suddenly, completely shifted. Passengers were whispering. A few of them had their phones out now, no longer pretending to scroll. Margo's palms were damp. Ethan finally spoke. "Margo," he said quietly, "I think we need to step away." "No," Margo snapped, turning toward him. "She's trying to cause a scene. The scene has already happened," Ethan said. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Margo clenched her jaw. She could still fix this. She turned back to Naomi, lowering her voice. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to do here, but let's not make this worse than it needs to be. Just move, and we'll put this behind us." Naomi blinked. Then, in a voice so calm it was almost cruel, she said, "It's already worse than it needs to be. And I'm not the one who made it that way." Margo's stomach dropped. The intercom crackled. "Miss Whitmore, is there a problem in first class?" The voice wasn't from the crew. It wasn't from security. It was from the captain. Margo's hands went ice cold. Passengers were staring openly now. Connor Harrington, who had been leaning back lazily before, suddenly looked more interested than amused. Jenna Blake had taken another step back, eyes darting toward Ethan, who looked at Margo like he already knew what was coming. Margo's throat felt tight. Naomi? She just sat there, waiting, because she already knew exactly how this was going to end. Margo Whitmore felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she refused to let the fear show. She would not lose control. Naomi Carter still sat in seat 2A, calm, composed, like she was the one in charge. The sound of the slap still echoed in Margo's mind, but what unsettled her the most was Naomi's silence. She hadn't shouted, hadn't protested, hadn't fought back. She had sent a message, and now she was waiting. Margo swallowed the lump in her throat and turned toward Ethan Reed, who stood frozen nearby. "Get security," she ordered, her voice sharp. Ethan hesitated. Now, Jenna Blake, the younger flight attendant, took an uneasy step forward. "Margo, maybe we should—" "No," Margo snapped, cutting her off. "I want her removed from first class. She doesn't belong here." Passengers were no longer pretending to ignore what was happening. A few had their phones out, subtly recording, while others whispered in hushed tones. The power dynamic had shifted. Margo felt it, and she hated it. A male passenger near the back of first class, Michael Jensen, an older businessman, cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying authority, "but I think we all saw what just happened. This woman has a first-class ticket. Why are you trying to remove her?" Margo's eyes snapped toward him, her temper flaring. "Sir, this is a crew matter. I suggest you stay out of it." Michael leaned forward. "Or what? You'll have me removed too." Margo hated how he said it. Like she was losing control. Like Naomi had already won. She took a breath, forcing herself to smile. "Sir, I assure you, this has nothing to do with her ticket. It's about maintaining order in the cabin." Naomi finally spoke. "Is that what you call this?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp. Margo ignored her. Security arrived, 2 uniformed officers stepping into the cabin with professional efficiency. One of them, Officer Martinez, scanned the tense scene. "What seems to be the issue here?" Margo straightened her shoulders. "This passenger," she gestured toward Naomi, "is refusing to comply with crew instructions. She needs to be relocated to economy." Martinez turned to Naomi. "Ma'am, do you have a valid first-class ticket?" Naomi reached into her blazer pocket and wordlessly handed him the ticket stub. Martinez studied it. His brow furrowed. "This seat assignment is valid." He turned back to Margo, his expression neutral but firm. "On what grounds are you asking us to move her?" Margo's patience snapped. "She is being disruptive," she hissed. "She has refused to comply." Martinez cut her off. "Refused to comply with what?" "Sitting in the seat she paid for." Margo felt heat rise in her face. Naomi still hadn't moved. The officer turned back to Naomi. "Ma'am, are you causing a disturbance?" Naomi met his gaze evenly. "No." Martinez exhaled. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you." "Ask me to do what?" Naomi interrupted smoothly. The tension snapped like a whip. Passengers leaned in, waiting for the next move. Margo knew this was spiraling out of her control. She clenched her fists. "I will not let this flight take off until she is moved," she declared. A collective murmur rippled through the cabin. Ethan stiffened. Michael Jensen let out a disbelieving laugh. "Are you serious? You're going to delay the flight over your bruised ego?" Margo turned to him, furious. "Sir, I suggest you mind your own business, unless you'd like to be permanently banned from this airline." Michael's face darkened. "Excuse me." Margo ignored him. She turned back to Martinez. "Remove her. Now." The officer hesitated. Then he pressed his radio. "Captain, this is Officer Martinez. We have a developing situation in first class." A beat of silence. Then the cockpit intercom crackled. "Name of the passenger?" Margo inhaled sharply, trying to hide her growing panic. "Naomi Carter." The entire plane fell into silence. For a long moment, there was no response from the cockpit. Then the intercom crackled again. But the voice that responded wasn't the captain's. It was someone else. And it was calm, authoritative, and far too dangerous. "This is Victor Langley." Margo's blood turned to ice. Passengers exchanged glances. Jenna's breath hitched. Even Connor Harrington, who had been completely indifferent to the situation up until now, sat up straighter. Victor Langley wasn't just anyone. He was the CEO of Falcon Airlines. And he had just spoken directly into the cabin. "Would you like to repeat what you just said, Miss Whitmore?" Margo's mouth went dry. Her hands shook. "Sir, no excuses." Langley's voice was like steel. "Did you or did you not just attempt to have a first-class passenger forcibly removed from her assigned seat?" Margo felt all the air leave her lungs. "Sir, I was only trying to." "Answer the question." The entire first-class cabin was dead silent. Every passenger was watching. Every crew member was listening. Margo had always been the one enforcing the rules. Now she was the one being interrogated. She swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." The intercom was silent. Then, "Captain Hayes, you are to escort Miss Whitmore to the rear of the aircraft immediately." Margo's knees nearly buckled. She turned, panic seizing her chest. But the cockpit door was already opening. Captain Douglas Hayes stepped out, his expression unreadable. Passengers murmured, phones still recording. Jenna took a step back, as if not wanting to be associated with Margo any longer. Ethan wouldn't meet her gaze. Margo felt the walls closing in. "Miss Whitmore," Captain Hayes said, his voice level but firm, "follow me." Now, Margo's stomach dropped. She had spent her entire career commanding first class. Now, she was being escorted out of it. And as she turned to leave, Naomi Carter still hadn't moved an inch. She didn't need to, because Naomi had already won. Margo Whitmore had never been on this side of an order before. For 15 years, she had been the one giving commands, deciding who belonged where, controlling every detail of the first-class experience. Now, she was the one being escorted out. Her legs felt stiff as she followed Captain Douglas Hayes down the narrow aisle. Passengers in business class peered over their seats, sensing the tension but unsure of what was happening. In economy, where Margo had spent years looking down upon the passengers as beneath her, the murmurs grew louder. She heard it, the hushed voices, the subtle chuckles. "Is that a flight attendant?" someone whispered. "Damn, she looks pissed." What did she do? Margo kept walking, refusing to acknowledge the stares. Her fists clenched at her sides. Her face burned with humiliation, but she would not let them see her break. "This way, Miss Whitmore," Hayes instructed, stopping near the crew jump seat in the back of the plane. Margo turned to him sharply. "This is ridiculous, Captain," she hissed. "You're humiliating me in front of the passengers." Hayes didn't blink. "You humiliated yourself." Margo's breath hitched. "I was enforcing order," she snapped. "That woman had a valid ticket." Hayes cut in, his voice calm but unyielding. "You assaulted a passenger and then tried to remove her without cause." She was being uncooperative. She was sitting in her assigned seat, Hayes corrected. Margo opened her mouth, ready to argue, but the radio clipped to the captain's shoulder crackled to life. "Hayes, this is the cockpit," came the voice of First Officer Liam Grayson. "We have an incoming priority message from corporate. It's Langley again. Victor Langley, CEO of Falcon Airlines." Margo's stomach twisted. Hayes pressed the radio. "Patch him through." A brief staticom. Then, "Captain Hayes, status update. Miss Whitmore has been removed from first class and is seated in the crew section as per your instructions, sir." A pause. Then Langley's voice, sharp and measured. "Proceed as normal." And "Captain." "Sir. Tell Miss Whitmore she will not be returning to duty upon landing." The words slammed into Margo like a physical blow. Her breath hitched. "Sir?" Hayes asked, though his expression remained unreadable. "I assume she understands what that means," Langley said smoothly. The intercom clicked off. Margo felt lightheaded. She turned to Hayes, her voice dangerously low. "What the hell does that mean?" Hayes didn't answer. "Right away." Then, without a hint of sympathy, he said, "It means you're done." The next 2 hours were the longest of Margo's life. She sat rigidly in the crew jump seat, her uniform suddenly too tight, too suffocating. The hum of the engines filled the silence, but it didn't drown out the thoughts screaming in her head. She had lost first class. She had lost her authority. And if Langley's words meant what she feared they did, she had just lost her career. Jenna and Ethan worked silently nearby, neither of them looking at her. At one point, Jenna approached the galley and hesitated near her. Margo glanced up. "Do you have something to say?" she snapped. Jenna swallowed. "No, ma'am." She turned away quickly, vanishing into the galley. Margo exhaled sharply. They were all against her. Even the crew she had trained, the people she had worked alongside for years, were turning their backs on her. And Naomi Carter? She was still in seat 2A. Untouched, unbothered, unmoved. Margo clenched her jaw. No, she wasn't finished yet. In the cockpit, Captain Hayes checked his messages. A new one had arrived from corporate. It wasn't from Victor Langley this time. It was from someone higher. He read the message carefully, then let out a slow breath. "First officer," he said, turning to Liam. "Yeah. Tell ground control to have an executive security team waiting at the gate." Liam's hands froze over the controls. He turned slowly. "This bad?" Hayes nodded. "Worse." Margo stared at the seatbelt sign as the plane began its descent. The tension in her chest had become suffocating. She kept expecting someone, anyone, to come back and tell her this was a mistake, that she would get a meeting, a hearing, a second chance. Instead, nothing. Jenna made the final descent announcement. Passengers secured their belongings. The plane touched down smoothly, and a soft round of applause rippled through the cabin. Margo barely noticed, because this wasn't over yet. She still had one more chance to fix this. She would speak to Langley directly. She would demand an appeal. The cockpit door opened. Captain Hayes stepped out. Passengers were still in their seats, waiting for the jet bridge to be attached. Margo stood immediately, moving toward him. "Captain, sit down, Miss Whitmore." His voice was final. Margo stopped short. Passengers turned, watching the exchange. "Sir, if I could just explain." "There's nothing to explain." Hayes stepped aside. Beyond him, visible through the open aircraft door, stood a team of security personnel in executive uniforms. And in the center of them, Victor Langley. Margo's blood ran cold. Whispers exploded around her. "Oh shit. Is that the CEO? She's done for." Margo's breath came fast and uneven. "Sir." Langley didn't speak right away. He just studied her. Then, with effortless calm, he gave a simple order. "Miss Whitmore, you're coming with us." And just like that, Margo Whitmore was no longer in control. Margo Whitmore had walked through countless airport terminals in her life, but never like this. Never with security flanking her on both sides. Never with passengers whispering, staring, recording. Never with the sinking, horrifying realization that she was no longer in control. As she stepped off Flight FA-176, the executive security team tightened their formation, shielding her from the growing crowd of onlookers. But it was too late. The moment she crossed the threshold of the jet bridge, she felt it, the weight of her downfall settling over her shoulders like a vice. Victor Langley, CEO of Falcon Airlines, didn't even look at her at first. He stood at the center of the security team, his expression unreadable, his suit impeccably tailored, his presence suffocating. When he finally turned his gaze on her, it was not with anger, but with something far worse, calculated indifference. "Miss Whitmore," Langley said, his voice low and controlled. "Come with us." Margo's stomach twisted. "Sir," she started, but the firm grip of one of the security officers on her arm cut her off. This was not a discussion. This was a verdict. And she had already lost. The walk through the terminal was brutal. Passengers turned. Their heads, some pretending not to watch, others openly staring. Margo heard the murmurs, the hushed speculation. "Is she in trouble? That's the woman from first class. I heard she hit someone. Did she get fired?" A few even lifted their phones, discreetly snapping pictures or recording short videos. Margo clenched her fists. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She had worked too hard, climbed too high, to be dragged through an airport terminal like a common criminal. And yet, as the glass doors of the executive security office slid open, she knew. This was real, and it was only getting worse. The interrogation room was colder than she expected. Bright white fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the metallic conference table. The walls were sterile, the air stale. There was no window, no exit besides the one locked door behind her. Margo sat rigidly, her hands folded in her lap, forcing herself to appear composed. Across from her sat Richard Hale, Falcon Airlines Director of Security and Compliance. Next to him, a woman in a navy blue blazer with a clipboard resting neatly in front of her. Rebecca Lynn, Senior Vice President of Crew Operations. Margo knew her by reputation. She also knew this was bad. Langley had handed her off to them, which meant he didn't need to deal with her anymore, which meant the decision was already made. Rebecca cleared her throat, flipping through the clipboard. "Miss Whitmore," she began, her tone neutral but sharp. "This is not a disciplinary meeting. This is a termination review." Margo's breath hitched. She had expected suspension, a formal hearing. Not this. "On what grounds?" she snapped. Rebecca barely lifted her gaze. "You physically assaulted a passenger," she stated flatly. "That alone is grounds for immediate dismissal under airline policy." Margo's fingernails dug into her palms. She was being difficult. "I was enforcing order." Hale let out a low breath, like he had heard this excuse too many times before. Miss Carter was sitting in her assigned seat, he said simply. You targeted her. You escalated the situation. And then, when she didn't comply, you struck her. Rebecca cut her off. And then you attempted to have her forcibly removed after you assaulted her. Margo's pulse pounded. She had no defense. Not against the videos. Not against the passenger testimonies. Not against the fact that everyone saw what she did. She was drowning. And no one was going to pull her back up. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Rebecca exhaled sharply and slid a folder across the table. Margo stared at it. She didn't want to open it. She already knew what was inside. Still, with shaking hands, she flipped it open. The first page slammed into her like a hammer. Her vision blurred. The next pages were policy violations, official reports, and legal statements. Her name, her employee ID blacklisted. No appeal. No suspension. No second chance. Rebecca's voice was calm but final. Effective immediately. You are relieved of duty and permanently barred from working for Falcon Airlines or any of its subsidiaries. Margo's throat was dry. This is ridiculous. Rebecca ignored her. Additionally, she continued, flipping another page, per request from corporate, a flag has been placed on your employment record. Margo froze. What kind of flag? She whispered. Rebecca finally met her eyes. A no rehire status across all major airlines, she said simply. Margo's heart stopped. You can't do that, she croaked. Rebecca slid another document toward her. A signed agreement between Falcon Airlines and multiple major carriers. Every single airline she could possibly work for had already been notified. She wasn't just fired. She was erased. She didn't remember signing the paperwork. Her hands moved on their own, scrawling her name on the dotted lines, mechanically acknowledging her own destruction. When it was done, Rebecca gestured toward the security officer standing at the door. Escort Miss Whitmore to crew storage. Have her return her uniform and badge before she leaves the premises. Margo didn't move. For years, she had walked through these halls with power, with status, with authority. Now she was being escorted out like a criminal. Security opened the door. She forced herself to stand. Forced herself to hold her head high. Forced herself to pretend this wasn't happening. But as she stepped into the hallway, she heard it. The whispers. The rumors spreading like wildfire. She got fired. I heard she slapped a passenger. She deserved it. And just as she reached the exit, she heard the voice that shattered what little was left of her composure. I hope you remember this. She turned sharply. Naomi Carter stood at the end of the hall. Not angry. Not smug. Just watching. Margo felt something crack inside her. She turned away, stepping through the doors for the last time. And just like that, her career was over. Margo Whitmore had never known silence like this before. The hollow emptiness of the terminal around her felt suffocating. She had walked through this airport 1,000 times, always with purpose, always in control, always feared or respected. But now, as she stood near the crew exit, gripping the strap of her handbag so tightly her fingers ached, she realized no one even looked at her anymore. She had been erased. The Falcon Airlines crew office door shut behind her with a finality that made her stomach twist. Inside, she had returned everything. Her uniform, her ID badge, the access card that once allowed her to walk into any crew lounge, as if she owned the place. Not anymore. She had seen the way Ethan and Jenna had looked at her as she walked out. Not with anger. Not even with pity. With indifference. Like she no longer mattered. She swallowed against a lump in her throat, pulling out her phone. There had to be a way out of this. She wasn't finished. Not yet. The first call went to Daniel Carter, an old connection at Skyline Airways, one of Falcon's rival airlines. It rang twice before a robotic voice answered. The number you are trying to reach is unavailable. Margo's brow furrowed. That didn't make sense. She had just spoken to him a few weeks ago. She dialed another number. Lisa Hunt, a former colleague who had moved to Vanguard Air. Straight to voicemail. Her heart pounded harder. She scrolled through her contacts, selecting another. Robert Fennell, a hiring manager at Silverjet Airlines. Blocked. Margo's breath hitched. She checked her email. Her company inbox was already deactivated. Her personal inbox flooded with rejection notices. She scanned the subject lines, her vision blurring with disbelief. Thank you for your interest, but we are unable to proceed with your application. Due to internal policies, we cannot consider your candidacy at this time. Falcon Airlines has flagged your employment record. We regret to inform you, Margo's head spun. It wasn't just Falcon. It was everyone. Langley hadn't just fired her. He had made sure she would never work in the industry again. A wave of nausea hit her, so hard she had to brace herself against a nearby pillar. She had lost everything. For the next hour, she sat in the airport cafe, scrolling frantically through job listings, sending out desperate applications, anything, anywhere. Each time, the responses were the same. No calls, no replies, nothing. At some point, she stopped checking her phone altogether. Instead, she just sat there, staring blankly at the bustling terminal outside, watching flight attendants in crisp uniforms walk past, watching pilots stride confidently toward their gates, watching airline staff move through the world she once ruled, a world that no longer belonged to her. The realization hit her like a knife to the gut. This wasn't just about losing a job. She had lost her identity. She had always been Margo Whitmore, the enforcer, the authority, the gatekeeper of first class. Now, she was just another disgraced employee with no future. Her fingers clenched around her cold coffee cup. "This isn't fair," she whispered under her breath. She had worked too hard to be thrown away like this. She had dedicated 15 years to this airline. She had earned her position. She had, Miss Whitmore. Margo's head snapped up. A woman stood beside her table, early 30s, professional suit, phone in hand. And she wasn't alone. Behind her, a young man with a camera slung over his shoulder waited expectantly. Margo's stomach dropped. "I'm Olivia Marks from the Aviation Press Network," the woman said, offering a neutral smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We were hoping to ask you a few questions about the incident on Flight FA-176. Margo felt cold. "No comment," she said sharply, grabbing her bag. "Miss Whitmore, the video of you striking a passenger has already gone viral. Would you care to share your side of the story?" Margo's breath shuddered. Viral. Of course it had. Her entire career had just been reduced to a 30-second video clip on the internet. Passengers had recorded it. News outlets had picked it up. The headline would be everywhere by morning. Former Falcon Airlines crew member assaults first-class passenger in viral video scandal. This wasn't just a job loss anymore. This was public humiliation. Margo shoved past Olivia, storming toward the exit. "Miss Whitmore," I said, no comment. The moment she stepped outside, the air hit her like a slap. It was overcast, the wind cutting against her skin. She stood at the airport pickup zone, staring at nothing, her heart pounding in her ears. She had nowhere to go, no plan, no future. For the first time, the panic fully sank in. There was nothing left. Margo Whitmore sat in the back of a rideshare, staring blankly out the window as the car sped down the highway. The city skyline loomed ahead, but it felt distant, like another world she no longer belonged to. Her phone sat in her lap, silent. No missed calls. No messages. No lifeline. She was numb. For years, she had controlled everything. Now, she had nothing. But one question still clawed at the back of her mind. Who the hell was Naomi Carter? Because no ordinary passenger had the power to do this. No regular woman could bring down an entire career with just a single text message. Margo had tried to dismiss the thought earlier, had tried to convince herself that Falcon Airlines overreacted, that Langley had used her as a scapegoat. But deep down she knew this was planned, and Naomi Carter wasn't just some nobody. 2 hours later, private office, Midtown Manhattan. Margo sat stiffly in front of Stephen Holloway, a former lawyer who now specialized in corporate reputation management. His office was modern, glass walls, sleek furniture, the scent of expensive bourbon lingering in the air. She had paid thousands just to sit in this chair, just for the possibility of salvaging what was left of her life. Stephen leaned back, skimming through the dossier in front of him. Then he exhaled sharply, setting it down. "You're screwed." Margot's jaw tightened. "That's not why I'm here." "No." "Then let me tell you something you don't want to hear." He folded his hands on the desk. "You didn't just lose your job, Margo. You've been erased. You pissed off the wrong person, and now you don't exist in this industry anymore." Margot's throat tightened. "Who?" she demanded. Stephen arched a brow. "You really don't know?" Margo shook her head. Stephen leaned forward. "Naomi Carter," he said slowly, "isn't just a first-class passenger." Margo stiffened. "She's a corporate lawyer. One of the most powerful in the country." Margot's breath hitched. "More than that," Stephen continued, "she's Naomi Carter, as in Carter Aviation Group." Margot's blood ran cold. Stephen smirked at her reaction. "Ring any bells?" Margo couldn't speak. She knew that name. Everyone in aviation did. Carter Aviation Group was a multi-billion-dollar holding company that had spent the last 5 years buying up airline stock, influencing board decisions, and quietly reshaping the industry. And Naomi Carter was directly tied to it. Margot's stomach dropped. "She's married to one of the executives?" she asked, desperate to believe there was another explanation. Stephen let out a short laugh. "Married? No, Margo. She runs the damn company." Margo stared at him. The pieces snapped into place, so violently she almost felt sick. She hadn't just harassed any random passenger. She had gone after the woman who could destroy an airline with a single phone call. And that's exactly what she did. Naomi hadn't needed to argue, hadn't needed to raise her voice. She had simply watched, waited, sent one text. And now Margo Whitmore was finished. Margo Whitmore sat motionless, her nails digging into the expensive leather armrests of the chair. Naomi Carter wasn't just powerful. She was untouchable. Everything, her termination, the blacklist, the public humiliation, wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad luck or overreaction. It was orchestrated. Margo had played a petty power game with a woman who actually had power, and she had lost everything because of it. Stephen Holloway, the corporate lawyer she had hired, drummed his fingers on his desk, watching her with mild amusement. "Now do you get it?" he asked. Margo swallowed. "I didn't know who she was," she murmured. Stephen chuckled. "That's the worst part, isn't it? If you had known, you would have treated her differently." He leaned forward, his smirk fading. "But the truth is, you shouldn't have had to know. She had a valid ticket. She had every right to be there. And you still tried to take that away from her." Margot's stomach twisted. She wanted to fight back. She wanted to say something, anything, to justify what she had done. But she couldn't. Because he was right. She had done this to herself. Stephen sighed, flipping a file shut. "Listen, Margo. You didn't just lose your job. You lost your career. Naomi Carter made sure of that. But here's the real problem." Margo braced herself. She didn't even have to try. Margot's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Stephen leaned back. She didn't need to pull strings. She didn't need revenge. All she did was expose what you did, and the system took care of the rest. Margot's breath caught. "Think about it," Stephen continued. "Falcon Airlines didn't protect you. The unions didn't step in. The industry didn't give you a second chance. Why?" Margo didn't answer. She already knew. Because she wasn't the first. She had seen it before: other flight attendants, other employees, other people who had been fired over less. Naomi Carter hadn't destroyed her. She had simply let Margo destroy herself. Margo walked out of Stephen's office in a daze, stepping onto the cold, gray Manhattan streets. The city buzzed around her, but she felt disconnected, as if she were watching everything happen from the outside. She had spent her entire life believing she was better than others. She had wielded her authority like a weapon, treating passengers as obstacles, as inconveniences, as people who needed to be put in their place. And now, she was beneath all of them. She reached for her phone. No new messages. No calls. Her former colleagues weren't checking in. No one was offering sympathy. She was truly alone. Her fingers hovered over her contacts list. She found Connor Harrington's number, the wealthy passenger she had tried to impress by removing Naomi. Maybe he could help. Maybe he could pull some strings. She hit dial. It rang once. Then, the number you have reached is no longer in service. Margo's grip tightened on her phone. He had cut ties too. Even the people she had sided with wanted nothing to do with her. She had burned every bridge. And now, she had nowhere left to go. Margo Whitmore had never imagined her life could unravel so quickly. Just days ago, she had been a respected senior flight attendant, commanding authority in first class, deciding who belonged and who didn't. She had thought herself untouchable. Now, she was nothing. She sat in a dingy studio apartment, staring at the email on her laptop screen. Application rejected. Again. She had lost count of how many airlines, hotels, and customer service jobs she had applied to. No one would even call her back. She had been erased from the industry she had once ruled. She had been the gatekeeper, and now every door was shut on her. The irony would have been funny, if it didn't hurt so much. Across the city, in a sleek glass-walled office, Naomi Carter leaned back in her chair, sipping her coffee as she read the final report on Falcon Airlines' internal investigation. She had never needed revenge. She had simply shined a light on what was already broken. Margo Whitmore was just one example, a symptom of a larger culture of discrimination and unchecked authority in the airline industry. And now, that system was being forced to change. Falcon Airlines had announced mandatory bias training, a full overhaul of crew policies, and a new passenger rights protection program. Naomi had ensured it wasn't just about her, because this wasn't just one woman's downfall. It was a warning to every person who had ever looked down on someone else and thought they didn't belong, to every person who had ever abused a little power, thinking it made them invincible, to every Margo Whitmore in the world. There would always be a price to pay, and some people would only learn when they lost everything. The end. What do you think? Did Margo truly pay the price for her actions? Should those who abuse their power face even greater consequences? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. And don't forget to tell me where you're watching from. If you believe that no one is above accountability, hit like, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories where justice prevails.